ask you a question. When was the last time that you felt really guilty or ashamed? Was it because you cheated? Maybe you cheated a lot. Was it because maybe you didn't tell your girlfriend the whole truth? Was it because you were on that website, you know, the one, a lot? Or maybe it's because you told your parents, oh, I'm going to this place, and you went there. But then you also went to some other places, and you failed to disclose who was going to be there and what you were going to be doing. Or maybe you told your parents, oh yeah, you know, my grades in that class, they're not that good, but I'm doing my best. But really, you just don't like it, and you don't care. These are all the sorts of things that we feel guilty about. And there's a lot more that could go on that list. Things that bring us a deep sense of shame. And when we feel ashamed, we participate in the same sort of behaviors as Adam and Eve. We have these inclinations to hide, to stretch the truth, to make up excuses, or just try to cover it up and act like it never happened altogether. When we feel guilty, we get really good at hiding. And here's what I mean by that. We hide from our small group leader, or our coaches, or our teachers, or our parents, or our grandparents. Anyone that knows us, that when they look us in the eyeball, we would feel like, I can't look at them because I feel so ashamed. I don't want to have conversations with them. I don't want to be seen by them because if they saw me, they might reject me. They might not like me. They might think I'm gross or broken or a bad person. And so I can't face them. We hide in other ways. You know, we play it cool. Oh yeah, it's no big deal. You know, I'm fine. You know, we do other things like we ghost our friends. Ghosting is one of the main ways people hide. When they're ashamed and they don't want to say the truth or they have a hard time saying it, it's just easier not to. You know, we do everything to act like nothing happened, even though on the inside we feel so ashamed that what we did was wrong that it eats us up. And it starts to change what we think about ourselves. We start to think of ourselves as bad, broken people. And we don't just do this with ourselves and with other people. We do this with God too. Only the tricky thing about when you try to hide from God is we all kind of secretly know that you can't, right? We're like, well, but I'm going to try, right? Like I'm going to try to hide from God. So when we know that we can't, but then we want to try to hide from God, what we start to do is we start to back away from our relationship with Him. We start to tell ourselves that He's not there or He doesn't really matter. You know what? He probably doesn't care anyway. And hiding from God starts to look a couple of different ways. It starts to look like maybe we just stop showing up for church. We don't engage in small group. We don't engage in large group rhythm. It's like I can't be around these people because it makes me feel guilty or ashamed. I can't hear about how good God is because maybe He thinks I'm awful. And so we disengage. Or maybe you feel like, yeah, I know God is real, but I can't pray because one, I don't want to face God. And two, I can't ask God for anything after what I've done. Or maybe you tell everyone, oh yeah, you know, I'm just real busy with school and, you know, now things are starting back up again with COVID. But the reality is you don't want to participate in this faith stuff anymore. And the main reason you don't want to participate is you're not sure that it's for you because you kind of start to feel like maybe you're not a good person. That, you know, probably faith stuff is for good people, right? And, well, that's probably not you. Has anybody felt that way? Well, today we are going to learn about guilt and shame and how Jesus responds to that by looking at His interactions with Peter. Now, Peter is a really interesting guy because he was one of Jesus's disciples and closest friends, and he ultimately becomes a key leader in the early Christian church. And Peter has several moments that are heavy with guilt and shame. And that gives us a really wonderful opportunity to watch how Jesus responds in these moments. You know, Peter messes up. He messes up a lot, but he sincerely wants to follow Jesus. And personally, I love Peter because I think a lot of us really identify with that. We genuinely want to be followers of Jesus. We genuinely want to be close to God, but we're like, I just feel like I can't because I just mess up too much, right? Like, I want this, but I don't want to feel bad. I don't want to feel like a constant failure. And so it's just easier to disengage. But just before Jesus is arrested, I want you to look at this interaction he has with Peter. He tells Peter essentially like, hey, I have witnessed your loyalty up until this point. But when it comes down to the very end, when I'm about to die, you're not going to be loyal to me. And Peter pushes back against that, being like, Jesus, I would never do that. I am going to be loyal to you until the death. But then he gets scared. And he gets scared because Jesus gets arrested and he goes on this bogus trial where they're trying to decide what to do with him. They ultimately decide to crucify him. And while this is going on, Jesus' disciples, people recognize them. And they're like, to Peter, they're like, you're with Jesus, right? And Peter's like, oh, no, I don't know that guy. I don't know that guy. And then, of course, Jesus is crucified. Now, I want you to think about the amount of guilt and shame Peter must have felt. Here's somebody that you believe is the Messiah, that you have faithfully followed for several years, and you just told him, I will stick with you until the death. And the moment you got scared, you're like, oh, no, I don't know that guy. I don't know him. And then he dies, which means you can't really apologize. It's like you're just left knowing you let him down and that you're going to have to live with that. Jesus dies on the cross, he's buried, but then he resurrects, and that's what we're celebrating today on Easter. The tomb is empty and Jesus is alive, and the whole direction of this story changes, which is incredible. But I wonder, we sit here and we celebrate the resurrected Jesus and we're like, this is amazing. But I wonder if Peter was like, oh no, how am I going to face him? I wonder if to Peter, the resurrection was a reminder of the guilt that he felt. And if he felt guilt, I wonder if he wanted to do the same things that we want to do, which is lie or exaggerate or defend himself or hide from Jesus altogether or play it cool like that never really happened. And so I want you to look at how Peter responds. So a few days later, Jesus is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter and some other disciples are in this boat, and they see Jesus. And Peter dives into the water, and he swims out to Jesus, where they find Jesus making a fish breakfast. And then Jesus brings up the thing that is inevitably weighing on Peter's mind. You can find this in John chapter 21, verses 15 through 17. It says, when they finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, that's his full name, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. And again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now, this might seem confusing. It's like, what's happening here? But I want to point out a couple things to you. Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And what Jesus does here is he asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? Jesus is giving Peter the opportunity to make it right. Jesus inevitably knows, because he's Jesus, the amount of guilt and shame that Peter is carrying around for denying him. And so Jesus gives Peter another chance. And in doing this, he reminds Peter that he is loved and he is forgiven. And Jesus tells Peter, I'm going to give you a second chance. And he even tells Peter he wants him to continue to lead these early followers in the early Christian church. He says, feed my sheep. And that's important because a lot of times we think, well, God might forgive me, but he probably thinks, yeah, I've forgiven you, but I've seen your character now. So I'm not really interested in using you for anything in this kingdom because I know what's inside of you now. Look at this interaction between Jesus and Peter. Jesus entrusts Peter with the responsibility of basically being a ministry leader. He says, I forgive you. The worst thing you've done doesn't define you. I love you, Peter. And I think that that's amazing because Peter probably entered into this interaction, feeling humiliated and guilty because he knew what he had done. But Jesus lets him make it right. Even though Peter may have said, I'm a bad person, Jesus says, I have not given up on you. I love you and I believe in you. Peter could have given into his guilt. He could have just spent his life hiding or pretending that that didn't happen. But that's not what Jesus wanted for Peter, and it's not what he wants for us either. He doesn't want you consumed by guilt and shame over the stuff that you've done. Jesus says, I love you. You are forgiven. You don't need to be defined by your guilt. And that is the message of Easter. Jesus wants Peter to experience this grace, this abundant grace that goes beyond the grave, and he wants the same thing for you. I think sometimes we think that God just wants us to sit around feeling guilty and ashamed, that he just wants us to know how bad we are. And what Jesus says here is, no, I'm going to give you a chance to make it right, and I want you to know that you're loved. I've got grace for you. Jesus says that to Peter, and he says it to us. That's God's heart for us. He doesn't want us to be consumed by guilt and shame and spend our lives hiding. He wants us to know that he's forgiven us and he loves us. So I don't know what you've been feeling guilty about. My guess is that there's probably something on your mind. But I would encourage you to do a couple of things. The first thing I would encourage you to do is to just be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself about what you've done and what's eating at you and making you feel guilty and ashamed, and what's got you trying to minimize what you've done, lying about it, feeling like you're avoiding other people, hiding from God, not wanting to be real and honest because you feel ashamed of what you've done. Just be honest with yourself about what it is. And the second thing I would encourage you to do, particularly on this Easter, is to remind yourself of God's grace for you. Ask God to remind you that he is with you and he is for you, even on the days when you mess up. Ask him to cover your guilt with the overwhelming reality of his love and grace that goes beyond the grave, the place where we think all things end, that the message of Easter is it doesn't end there, that God loves us beyond the grave. Easter shows us that Jesus is bigger than our guilt and our shame. And when Jesus gives us his grace, it's ours for the taking. So when those feelings of guilt kick back in, ask God to give you a new reaction, to remember that you are deeply loved and worthy, even when you make mistakes. That's offered to Peter and it's offered to us. Last, I would encourage you to keep showing up. Resist the urge to hide. Guilt and shame will have you hiding, avoiding, lying, making excuses, minimizing. Instead of hiding, know that you are loved and forgiven. Stop hiding. Show up. Engage. Stop running from God and everything that seems to have God's stamp on it, and that includes church. Some of us have been running from church, we run from small group, we run from prayer. Anything that feels like it has the stamp of God on it, we're like, I can't do that because I feel too ashamed. Perfection is never the requirement. We never see that from God. God doesn't expect us to be perfect. This community is about grace, not perfection. After the resurrection, Peter didn't hide from Jesus, and he could have. Peter made a choice to trust Jesus' heart. And the invitation for you today is to trust Jesus' heart for you. Trust his grace, receive his grace, and know that there's not a limit to it. It goes beyond the grave. And we don't have to live our lives in shame. We can keep showing up. Love you guys.